Right now, I am unemployed, which means I have my own startup. I'm doing a thing called DYDX, which is a different thing. Previously, I was CTO at a company called Zoom.ai. We did an AI-based assistant for enterprises. But forget about all that, right? I'm here to talk about Flutter and what Flutter is and where it came from. Has anyone worked with Flutter yet? Great. You guys can play Pokemon Go. Everyone else will learn something new. No, I'm joking. I think everyone's going to learn something. And has anyone done Android, iOS development here? Great, awesome. So this talk is really around taking those concepts that you guys have done with Android and iOS development in the past and bringing it to the Flutter world, right? And if you have no mobile experience, that's fine too. It doesn't really matter. So Flutter, where it came from, I think I can, testing, yes. So back, I think 3 years ago, I was in Berlin, and this was around the time when I was doing a lot of Dart. And Dart is this language that Google has that was promised to, falsely during their PR, was promised to kill JavaScript, which inadvertently killed Dart in a lot of sense because people started getting really defensive about JavaScript, blah, blah, blah. That wasn't the case. Dart was just designed to be a better version of a web language that you can write in. Google made some mistakes there. But anyways, I was a Google developer expert for Dart, and I was giving a talk on moving from Node.js to Dart. I had another startup back then, and I was doing that. And during that time, I think this was Munich, and I was sitting in the front row, and I was watching Eric Seidel, who is the Chrome, at that time was the head of Chrome, come on stage and talk about a project that they're working on called Sky. And what was Sky? And what happened was, at first I thought Sky was going to be something like Adobe Cordova or just another web framework to write mobile apps with. But it turned out that Sky is actually a way to take Dart and write native apps with it. And I was skeptical. I said, great, another one of these tools that are never going to probably be done, and Google's going to kill it, probably. But that didn't happen. And 3 years later, we're at a point where Flutter's become extremely popular, and a lot of big companies are using it. And so during this time frame, what I saw was, what they did was they took Chrome, and they said, great, we don't need HTML, we don't need CSS, we don't need anything. We just need something to render applications. And Chrome has the best rendering engine because Chrome works absolutely everywhere. So they took the rendering engine of Chrome and they said, we just need a way to draw something on the screen. And they had to find a language to draw something on the screen. And the language that they ended up with was Dart. And the way they did this was internally at Google, they had this big matrix. I assume it was a Google spreadsheet. And so they had this big matrix, and they started talking to all different teams. And they said, what language do you use? Why do you use it? Is this good for you? What are the pitfalls, pros and cons, blah, blah, blah. And so they went to, possibly every team you can think about. And one of the teams they landed up at was the AdWords team. And AdWords is this tiny fraction of Google that makes up all their money. And so they talked to the AdWords team and they said, hey, AdWords team, what are you guys using? And it turned out they were using a language called Dart. And they started probing why. If AdWords, something that Google relies on, can use Dart, then what's so special about this language? And they said, well, previously we were using Java to write their UIs and stuff, and they found that Dart helped them be more productive, reduced bugs, just the way the language was designed. So they said, you know what, I think this language could be really good for the next wave of mobile apps, right? Google created Android. Google understands the pitfalls of Android. Google also understands the pitfalls of Java and all the crazy stuff that happened there. So they said, cool, let's figure out what we can do with Dart. And they started taking Dart and started drawing stuff to the screen on the Chrome rendering engine. So if anyone's ever played games here, like Unity, Flutter is basically Unity for apps, right? That's all it is. There's nothing special here. It's just the same concept of there's a rendering engine that runs on all platforms, and I'm going to draw something on it. In the Unity sense, they draw games on it. In Flutter, you could do games, but it's built for apps. The components are designed for apps. The framework's designed to write apps and not games. And so that's really where Flutter comes from. And the three pillars that Flutter is built on is this idea of having 60 frames per second native Android and iOS, right? So right now, if you run a native iOS app, or a native Android app, it runs smoothly. Unless a developer coded it badly, it's going to work fine, or your phone is slow. Flutter decided we're going to have to compete on that aspect. We have to make it seamless so the user has no idea that this is a Flutter app or a Google native Android or iOS app. And so I was in San Francisco last year, I think, or the year before that, and I went to the team where Flutters were being worked on, and they have these big screens everywhere. And whenever they push some code, not only do they check if their system's breaking, they also check if this, the UI components are drawing at 60 frames per second, right? So this is the type of focus that they have to make sure that the components are smooth, and they don't want it to break. The other thing is they want to emphasize this is not a web view. Early on, there was some misconception that because this is built on top of the Chrome rendering engine, this is a web view. Web view apps are garbage. We all know that, right? Like, that is terrible. Web views are getting better now, but honestly, web views are garbage. With that said, Flutter is not web view. All Flutter did was take the rendering engine from Chrome, right? The web view part is HTML, CSS, and the JavaScript execution engine, all that stuff. This is just a rendering engine. So this is not a web view. And lastly, they follow these three things called fast, beautiful, and natural. Fast is just 60 frames per second. Natural is when a user uses your app on Android, it should behave like an Android app. When without any code changes, if you deploy to iOS, your app should behave like an iOS app. So on Android, when you're flinging your phone, you get this weird blue glow at the bottom of a list view that you know that at the end of the list. On iOS, you have this rubber band effect, right? You don't want to code that. You don't want to say, if my app is running on Android, do the weird blue glow. If it's running on iOS, do the rubber effect. And so Flutter decided that we're going to do all that for you, all the physics, the animations, everything. It's going to be on the Flutter rendering engine. All you have to worry about is writing your code and deploying on a certain platform. And then the native, natural aspects of those platforms are handled by the framework. Lastly, beautiful, right? Again, when I was in San Francisco, I was talking to the Flutter team, and they were sitting right beside the material design team. And the reason was Google invested a lot of money into material design to make sure that they have this consistent design standard. It's absolutely everywhere, Gmail, Inbox, wherever. And so Google said, cool, we're going to take these components and we're going to make sure that they're up to spec on Flutter. That means that if you have a button, it looks like the most spec version of the material button, right? This means that your users are familiar with it. If users use Gmail, if they use Evernote or any other material design-based app, they know how to use your app already. And so you don't have to worry a lot about how do I take just square boxes and figure out how to make them look material designy. Now, with that said, Google is also investing now in Flutter in terms of having components that look very iOS-based, right? So you could have a button that looks like a very material design button on Android, and on iOS, a Cupertino button. However, if you look at most iOS apps and even Android apps, they're all following a flavor of material design now. They all have a top bar, they all have a drawer, a fab at the bottom, right? So it's not that your app will stand out on iOS in terms of being this ugly stepchild somewhere. It's just going to look like any other app. So I'm going to show a demo and get started. So this is a live demo, and I love doing live demos because I love living on the edge. So when I create all right. So how do you code a Flutter app? Right? You can use VS Code, you can use IntelliJ, you can use WebStorm, or any modern IDE. You can even use Vim, if anyone's crazy enough to do that. I have a friend that uses Vim for absolutely everything. He's my co-founder. So I'm sitting there, and I look to my right, and it's like he's in the Matrix, because it's just like green text. And he likes doing Flutter as a side project. And whenever I look, I'm like, how do you even know what's happening? And it's just this green text flowing. He's plugged in. So anyways, I'm using IntelliJ. That's just because I'm used to it coming from Android Studio. But VS Code, you can totally use also. So I'm just going to create a new project here. And it says Flutter. I can create a new Flutter app. And on this screen, essentially what the screen is just asking you is, what's the project name of your Flutter app? Do you want what's the Android language you want, and what's the iOS language you want? So Flutter, you're writing your applications in Dart, right? However, if there's a sensor or something on a phone that Flutter doesn't support, like for example, tomorrow Samsung comes out with like a nose sensor where you unlock your phone with your nose, Flutter's not going to support that. That's not their problem. So what you can do is you can actually build plugins for Flutter, and we'll get into that later. And you can say, cool, if my app is running on a Samsung device, here's the Java code or the Kotlin code that's going to talk to the nose sensor and expose that to my app. So, and then anyways, I can select all this, I can click finish, and it will create my Flutter app. So I'm going to run this Flutter app on the iPhone SDK simulator. And the reason is the simulator is just so much faster. Oh man, so much faster than the Android simulator. So I'm going to run it here. And what it's going to do now at the bottom is it's actually going to take my Flutter code, and this is the native part of Flutter. People get confused saying, well, Flutter's not a native app. Technically it is. What it's doing is taking the Flutter code and it's actually compiling it down into an iOS app. It's not using a web view like I previously said. It's not using any magic, right? It's just taking that code, compiling it, and making it run just like any other iOS app. And so here, my app's running, and here I have an amazing app that I'm going to make tons of money with called the Clicker app, right? And so what happens with the Clicker app is whenever I click plus, it moves a button, right? Amazing. Mark Zuckerberg's going to buy me out soon. So with this, imagine I'm building this app, right? One of the key issues with Android iOS development is that the time to build the app, right? You have a great idea, you're building it, and then you run into a roadblock, right? Your designer comes up to you and says, Faisal, our brand colors aren't blue, they're actually red. And you're like, okay, fine. So you go sit there and you change the color, you hit run, and then Gradle pops up, it compiles your app, it takes like another 20 minutes, right? Realistically, it takes like another 2 minutes while your designer's just standing beside you, waiting for your app to compile. It compiles and the designer says it's the wrong color. Then you do the whole cycle again, right? And imagine you're just working for yourself, you have an idea, and you're developing it. You're stuck in this cycle of just waiting for the app to compile, running it, realizing it's not the right thing, on and on again. With Flutter, there's a really interesting feature called hot reload. And if you've ever done web development, hot reload is going to seem supernatural because that's what it is. You hit save on an HTML page, you hit reload, and it's there. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the brand color of this app to red. So colors.blue, I'm going to change it to red. I'm going to hit save. And when I hit save, my app's already changed, right? Just like that, my colors have changed. Now, that's cool for colors. That's a small little magic trick. But what about if I want to add some new items to my screen? So what I'll do is I'll take this text button, or text view, and I'll create another thing called Hello Google here. Hello Google. So now I'm actually adding stuff. I'm not just replacing stuff. I'm adding a whole new component in the widget tree. I'm going to hit save, and it's going to say Hello Google there. Now I'm going to change the size of that text, which is, don't even remember now. Text, I don't know how to change text now. I'm blanking out. Anyways, so I'm going to remove it. Now, the other really interesting thing I can do is I can actually change the implementation of my method. So here, when I'm pressing plus, what it's doing is it's actually just counting up by 1. But what about if I want to make it count by 5, right? I can go into the implementation here, and I can say counter is equal to counter plus 5. I'm going to save it. I'm going to go back. I'm going to hit this, and now it's going up by 5. So this is a very simple example, but this can apply to anything. If you're building a login screen and you send the wrong username and password over, you can just go back, edit your code, and hit save, and it will fix that bug that you have. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is the state stays the same. That number 82 hasn't gone away. Even though I'm reloading my application, it's still going right back to 82, and it's not going back to 0. This will save you a tremendous amount of time. Imagine you're like 6 screens deep with an OAuth token from somewhere, managing some state, and then your app, you have to reload your entire app. You got to do that whole thing again. With Flutter, you don't have to. Now, I'm going to show you something crazy. This is purely a stunt. A while ago, a friend of mine asked a question on Stack Overflow. how do I do a relative layout in Flutter? He comes from the Android world. In Android world, you have layouts that you can refer to each other. And so he asked that question, how do I do a relative layout in Flutter? And cool, so he asked this question, and he said, this is what I want to make, this is my Android app, and this is what I want to do. And so someone from the Flutter team got back to him, and this is what's great about the Flutter community. They will go out of their way to help you. So this is someone from the Flutter team. He gets back to him and he says, cool, Tawfiq, this is how you do it, blah, blah, blah. And then he said, here's the whole code for your entire application, right, for that whole screen. Now, this is great. Imagine you're online, you discover something like this, and you want to try it out. Typically, you would create a new file, you would paste it in, and run your application. But because of hot reload, I can take this entire thing, and I can go into my IDE, and I'm going to replace the entire application here. All right? I haven't reloaded my application. This is crazy. Hopefully it works. I'm going to hit save. And what happens is that the entire application has changed, right? This is a whole new application. And not only is this a whole new application, it's actually interactive too, right? I can swipe to new screens. And this is the power of hot reload, where this is something you'll probably never do. You're not going to just in a minute change your application. However, the reason I show this demo is it actually pushes hot reload to its most edge, where you know that you can actually replace a whole lot of code without hot reload breaking on you and telling you, sorry, you got to restart your application. Now, it breaks if I go the other way, I think. So let's see what happens. Oh, no, actually it didn't. Great. So I reverted my application back. And so this is a great way to test stuff. If you find something on GitHub and you want to just test it in your application, you can copy and paste that code and see it in action, right? Hot reload fails when you're actually making core changes. Like imagine you have a database and you've changed the entire database from SQL to like, I don't know, something else that's running on device. It's not perfect. It's going to complain that, hey, I'm missing methods and stuff. But typically, you're not changing core implementations like that. So let's go back to the presentation. Cool. So here, this is a very high level of how a Flutter app, Flutter framework looks like. At the top, you have your material design widgets, and now you have Cupertino also. Underneath that, you have a layer called widgets. Everything in Flutter is a widget, right? And what's neat about it is think of a widget like a Lego block. And just like a Lego block, where you can theoretically shove any Lego block into another, even though it looks like crap, it will still work. That's what you can do with Flutter, right? You can take a button and stick a list view in it. Why would you do that? I don't know. But technically, you can do that because all widgets take child, which is a type of a widget. And so widgets are composable in the technical term, which they can all just build on top. So you can get some really creative concepts running that you can't really do in other languages, other mobile frameworks like Android or iOS, without a lot of work. Which also means that if you really, really do not like material design or iOS and you want to build your own UI, right, which is some crazy, crazy UI, you can just forget about material design widgets and extend the widget, right? Take the widget, and because they're all composable, you can actually just copy and paste the code from the widget source code and just modify it to yours. So you can have like, my Google button that looks crazy, and when you hit it, it makes the noise of money. Then you have the rendering engine, which is the Flutter Google rendering engine, Chrome rendering engine at the bottom. And underneath that, you have animation, painting, gestures, and services. Animation, painting, and gestures, that's just, if you want a double click on a button, if you want a side swipe, whatever, it all works. Gestures are the same. And then services are what talk to your native Android and iOS app. Most of the time, you're not going to code services anymore. If this was 2 years ago, you were doing a lot of services because no service really existed. But now, there's so many services on Pub, which is a Flutter's repository, that you can find it for anything, right? And if there is a no sensor, then you can build it and help the open source community. Underneath that, it's the shell, which honestly, that's just like all C++ stuff, so I don't think anyone cares about that. So What's interesting here, actually, is with Flutter, you're promised this one code base, multiple platforms, right? And maybe if you're building a small app, it doesn't really matter. But what's interesting about this is that you can build an Android app, you can test an Android app, and deploy it to iOS. And as you move on in your career and join bigger teams and stuff, this becomes even more critical, because what happens is you have a feature, and you want this feature to be running on Android and iOS. What will happen is you will have two parallel teams working on the same feature, and they'll have their own set of bugs and their own set of issues. And what mostly always happens is one team is slightly ahead of the others, and the other team, you just have to wait till the other team launches. With Flutter, the promise is you can write that feature and just deploy it on both platforms at once. So I was reached out to a big company. I'm not going to say the name, but they have like 100 million installs on their Android and iOS app. And they were asking me, okay, well, we want to move to Flutter, right? What can we do, and how will this help us? So I gave them a breakdown, and their biggest complaint was not that Android and iOS were bad. They were doing a better job. They were doing a good job in terms of getting 100 million installs on their app. They're making a lot of money and movies and all that stuff. But their problem was they just couldn't get the right velocity, because every time they had a new feature, they just had to wait for the web team to implement it, and then the Android and iOS team were lagging behind. And so with Flutter, you could get multiple platforms really quickly. And recently, January, Flutter announced something very, very interesting called Hummingbird. Has anyone heard about Hummingbird? One person, cool. Hummingbird is a way to take your Flutter apps and deploy it to web. So now you get 3 platforms. You get mobile, and you get web. Then they also announced one extra thing, which is, I actually don't know what the cool code name for that is, but you can take your Flutter app and deploy it to desktop also. So now you get all platforms with one code base. There's an asterisk there, right? If you're using like a GPS framework for Android, you're probably not going to get access to that on desktop or web. But for, say, 80% of applications, if you're building something and you build it in a very well-architected way, you can deploy your same application with very minimal code for platform-specific to all platforms very quickly, right? So that's a very interesting promise of Flutter. In fact, there is a very supposed to be secret, but not because it's open source project by Google called Fuchsia, where Google's investing a lot of time and resources into what does the next version of mobile look like, right? They've done Android for the longest time, and it's made them a lot of money, but what if another company comes out with a better version of Android and kills them? So what Google likes to do, and this is coming from the product manager I spoke on Fuchsia, is they like to think about, well, what can we do to disrupt ourselves, right? And so Fuchsia is this idea of how do we disrupt Android? Maybe Fuchsia amounts to nothing, but what the interesting thing about Fuchsia is they're using Flutter to build the entire UI and the entire operating system, right? And you can actually go and download a Fuchsia build and run it on your Android app, because again, Flutter is just Flutter, because it can run everywhere. You can actually take Fuchsia, which is the OS, and take the entire UI component and run it on your phone to see potentially what the next version of mobile computing looks like. If you're an Android developer, there's this documentation that I wrote on Flutter, and I'll just show you guys. Flutter.dev, cool docs. Where is this platform? Oh, there we go. No, where's this resources? Flutter for Android. There we go. Cool. So there's a documentation for Android developers, and the same documentation exists for iOS and React and even web developers who aren't just doing HTML and CSS. And it's Flutter for Android developers. And what this documentation will do is you understand Android pretty well. You know how activities work, a list view works, and on iOS, you know how UI controller view works, all that stuff. How do you take that knowledge and port it over to your Android? So the Flutter community got people. I did the Android one, and it's basically what is the equivalent of a view in Flutter. And then I write about, this is what a view is on Android, this is what it is on Flutter. And so what's nice about this is there's a lot of tutorials. You can kind of take all this. What's this question for? How do I update widgets? Right. You can take this question, and again, because of hot reload, you can go in, paste it, and just deploy it. Oh, there we go. I finally broke something. You can start deploying it and actually test out your knowledge there very, very quickly with hot reload and just reading the documentation. And again, if you're an iOS developer, the same documentation exists for iOS developers. Actually, a fun video there too. Fancy. Same thing, right? So you can easily get sped up on your Flutter knowledge. And honestly, a lot of people get discouraged because they think about, well, Dart is another language I have to learn. Honestly, Dart is the most boring language on earth. It's because you already know it. If you've done JavaScript, Java, or Python even, you already know Dart, right? There's nothing to learn. There's very interesting things you can do once you become an expert at it, but just to get 99% of the way there, you already know it. Right? I can guarantee I can show you a piece of Dart code and everyone here knows, as long as they have some programming experience, they know what it's doing. Right? So Dart is a very simple language to learn, a very boring language. iOS developers, web developers, cool. So this was around, and I spoke about this before, so I'll show you some sample projects. Does Flutter support X? Like I said before, Flutter's job is not to support every framework or plugin on your mobile devices, right? So what Flutter did was said, hey, community or Google contractors or whatever, go and build plugins for Flutter that are most commonly used. So Flutter has a plugin for in-app purchase. Flutter has a plugin for GPS and Firebase and notifications, whatever. But the Flutter framework itself, it's not responsible for it, right? All Flutter as a team is responsible for is to make sure that the rendering engine, the components, and the architecture work fine. And so there's a website called pub.dartlang.org, or pub.dev actually. Pub.dev, if you've ever done any Node.js development, is the NPM of Dart, right? Here you can find plugins for absolutely everything. So say if I want a plugin for in-app purchases, I can search in-app purchase. And I can see there's a lot of plugins here, right? In-app purchase, a Flutter plugin for in-app purchase. I can take that, put it in my app, and automatically I now have code that's running, native code, running on iOS and Android that deals with in-app purchase. So this is a very easy way to jumpstart my application without having to rewrite a bunch of stuff. Same thing for GPS, right? There's a whole bunch of GPS libraries out there. So really, what you'll be focused on right now, if you're doing a Flutter app, is actually just building your app and not worrying about integrations, because most of the integration work is done for you already. So I'm going to show an app of a real-world app called Reflectly. And I like showing this app. I have like no stake, or I haven't even built this app. I wish I did, because they make a lot of money now. But this is a very interesting app that's built entirely in Flutter, and it doesn't specifically follow material design or Cupertino. What they did was they said, we're going to use some elements of material design, but we're also going to redesign our app to be very, very custom to us. And I don't recommend you doing this because it's just a lot of work. And this is not what the app was before. After a lot of iterations till they found a product market fit, they know that people are using this app, they did this. So it's called Reflectly. I'm going to run my phone here. Cool. Cancel. Great. Wow. Terrible. Okay, everyone can see my phone. And you guys can download this on your iOS or Android also. It's called Reflectly. And so I turn it on, and you can see these nice animations, the bubbles popping up and stuff. This is a Flutter app, right? And when you use it, it'll be a bit janky because of the weird screen mirroring, but when you use it, you'll see that it's 100% fluid. There's very little issues happening on here. So here, they call me Faisal. Go. I'm gonna hit done. And you can see the animations, and they're very nice. And I can change the entire color of this color scheme of the app here. And you can see the animations bubble up. So they did a lot of really nice work here. And it's in Flutter. And so what they did was, there's a nice blog post where they built this, and they said, great, now Flutter came out with web, how do we port this to the web? And his quote is, I think it took him 3 beers to port this to the web. That's all he did, right? And so it's very easy to take Flutter and move it around to different platforms as long as those rendering engines exist. So I recommend everyone try this app and play around with it and see the extent of what Flutter can do. There's also a Flutter Gallery app for Android and iOS that you can see all the different components and widget sets of Flutter. That's just basically like a kitchen sink of like, here's how a button looks like, here's how a tooltip looks like, et cetera, et cetera. So with that said, does anyone have any questions?